He was born different, but no one noticed at first. As an infant, he rarely cried, rarely laughed, and seemed content staring at nothing for hours. His parents thought he was just a quiet baby. But by the time he was 14 months old, the signs became impossible to ignore. While other children babbled their first words, he remained silent. When his mother called his name, he didn't respond. At the playground, he didn't engage with the other toddlers. He simply flapped his hands repeatedly, lost in his own world. Concerned, his parents took him to a doctor. After a series of evaluations, they received the diagnosis: autism. His mother cried, fearing for his future. His father remained silent, gripping her hand tightly. As he grew older, his differences became more pronounced. He didn't understand emotions the way others did. When his mother cried, he would simply stare at her, confused. He didn't make friends. He didn't know how. Social interactions were exhausting, and loud noises overwhelmed him. School was difficult. Teachers complained that he didn't participate in class. He never raised his hand, never made eye contact. He excelled in subjects that required memorization, but struggled in anything requiring social interaction. His parents eventually hired a personal teacher, someone who could work at his pace. He thrived under one-on-one instruction, absorbing information like a sponge. But no amount of teaching could change the way the world saw him. Strange, distant, different, he didn't mind. He preferred being alone. Until the accident. It was a cold evening when he and his father left the house. His mother had asked them to pick up groceries, and though he disliked going out, he never argued with his father. The fog was thick that night, rolling in like a heavy blanket over the city. As they drove, the headlights barely cut through the mist. His father gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Stay alert," his father muttered, mostly to himself. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out of the window, unfazed by the fog or his father's tense expression. He preferred silence. Words were often confusing, emotions even more so. But then, without warning, the world changed. A loud crack, the car jerked violently. The bridge beneath them collapsed. For a terrifying moment, their car teetered on the edge of the broken road. Metal screeched. His father's breathing was ragged. But by some miracle, the car didn't fall. Others weren't so lucky. Through the shattered windshield, he saw vehicles plunging into the river below. He heard screams. A truck barely missed them as it skidded across the pavement. Then, silence. His father slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from his forehead. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. He was alive, but barely. People rushed to help, dragging them from the wreck. His father was unconscious, but breathing. An ambulance arrived. He climbed in beside his father, watching as paramedics worked on him. "Sir, can you hear me?" one of them asked. No response. The ambulance sped through the city, sirens wailing. They reached the hospital in minutes, but inside, the waiting room was chaos. Injured people filled every seat. Nurses ran back and forth, doctors shouting orders. "We need a surgeon now," one of the paramedics called out. "I'm sorry," a nurse said, her voice strained. "Every OR is full." The paramedics exchanged glances. "We can't wait. We have to transfer him." His father was loaded back into the ambulance. The nearest available hospital was an hour away. Halfway there, his father's breathing became uneven. A beeping sound filled the air, rapid, frantic. The paramedic checked the monitor. "He's crashing." They worked desperately to save him. Chest compressions, oxygen mask, adrenaline injection. Nothing worked. The beeping stopped. His father was gone. The paramedic sighed and shook his head. The ambulance slowed. They didn't need to rush anymore. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctor checked for signs of life but found none. He was officially pronounced dead. His mother arrived minutes later. When she saw the body, she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. But he just stood there, silent, expressionless. His mother clung to him, shaking, but he didn't react. He felt something deep inside, like a weight pressing on his chest, but he didn't know how to express it. He simply watched as they covered his father's body with a white sheet. Something changed in him that night. 2 years later, he announced he wanted to go to medical school. Medical school was not built for someone like him. From the moment he stepped into the lecture hall on his first day, he knew he was different. The room was loud, too loud. Students chatted excitedly, forming groups within minutes. He remained at the back, gripping his backpack strap tightly, overwhelmed by the noise and movement. The first few months were brutal. He aced every written exam. He had always been good at memorizing, but the practical work was a nightmare. Nobody wanted to be his lab partner. It wasn't that they were cruel. They just didn't understand him. He didn't know how to start conversations. He didn't respond the way they expected. He didn't laugh at their jokes or complain about the workload like everyone else. He worked in silence, absorbing knowledge but never connecting with those around him. Worst of all were the surgical practice sessions. He struggled with fine motor skills, something that had always been an issue since childhood. His hands trembled slightly when he held a scalpel, and in surgery, precision was everything. During one practice session, they were given a pig's heart to suture. He tried to steady his fingers, but they wouldn't cooperate. The thread slipped. The suture was uneven. One of his classmates scoffed. "How are you going to be a surgeon if your hands shake like that?" The others laughed. He didn't respond. He simply cleaned his tools and left. But inside, something burned. For the first time, he wanted something, not just to pass exams, not just to prove he was intelligent. He wanted to be in the operating room. He wanted to hold a scalpel and not fail. But no one believed he could. One day, during a particularly difficult practice session, a fellow student approached him, one of the few who hadn't laughed at him. "Hey," the guy said, setting down his own tools. "How do you study?" He blinked, caught off guard. "I read," his classmate chuckled. "I figured, but how do you remember everything? You never miss a question on tests." He thought about it. "I don't know. I just read and remember." The guy shook his head, amazed. "I suck at theory, but I'm good in the OR. Maybe we can help each other out." He hesitated. He had never studied with anyone before, but for some reason, he nodded. They began practicing together. His new friend, his only friend, helped him with his motor skills, forcing him to repeat small, controlled movements over and over until his hands learned precision. At first, it seemed impossible. His hands would shake, and frustration would build inside him. Again, his friend would say, "You're getting better." Little by little, he improved. His hands still trembled sometimes, but he learned to control them. One day, during another suture practice, he picked up the needle and thread and, for the first time, stitched the wound perfectly. His friend grinned. "Told you," but no matter how good he became, most of his classmates still doubted him. And then came his first patient death. The first time a patient died under his care, something inside him broke. It was supposed to be a routine surgery, a middle-aged woman with a heart condition. He wasn't the lead surgeon, just an assisting resident, but he had studied every detail of her case. He knew the procedure step by step. Everything was going fine, until it wasn't. Midway through, her heart stopped. The room filled with urgent voices, the beeping of monitors turning frantic. The lead surgeon barked orders. "Start compressions." He stepped back as they fought to bring her back. He watched as her pulse weakened, as her skin turned pale. He memorized every detail, the time, the method, the medications they used, because that's what he did. He observed. He absorbed information, but nothing worked. The woman's body lay still on the operating table, lifeless. The lead surgeon sighed and removed his gloves. Time of death, 3:47 p.m. The room was silent. He stood frozen, staring at the woman's face. Dead, just like his father. A weight settled on his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. He felt something overwhelming, but he didn't know what to do with it. So he left. He walked straight to the nearest supply closet, closed the door, and sat on the floor. And then, for the first time since his father's death, he cried. He didn't sob loudly. There were no dramatic gasps for air. Just silent tears streaming down his face, his breath uneven as the weight inside him became unbearable. The door opened suddenly. A group of his colleagues stood there, looking down at him in shock. One of them smirked. "Are you seriously crying?" He didn't respond. He didn't know how. Another one laughed. "Damn, "You're really not built for this. Guess we found our new crybaby." The nickname stuck. From that day on, they mocked him behind his back. Every time a patient died, they'd nudge each other and whisper, "Crybaby's gonna lock himself in the closet again." He never cried in front of them again. But every time he lost a patient, he found a quiet corner and let the tears fall. Alone. His only friend, the one who had helped him with surgery, found him one night after another failed operation. "You need to stop hiding," his friend said, sitting beside him on the hospital stairwell. He didn't answer. His friend sighed. "You feel things differently, but that doesn't make it wrong. You care. That's not a weakness." He wiped his face, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to stop feeling like this." His friend leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Then don't. You just have to learn to live with it." He didn't respond, but those words stuck with him. And little by little, he did learn. He still cried when patients died. He still felt emotions he didn't fully understand. But he never let it stop him. And one day, an opportunity came that would change everything. He never expected to be in the same room as the vice president of the state, let alone operate on him. The man had a severe heart condition, one eerily similar to the one that had taken his father's life. The entire hospital was buzzing with preparations. This wasn't just another patient. This was a political figure, a man whose survival mattered to an entire nation. The hospital board held a meeting to select the team of surgeons who would be in the operating room. At first, it was a volunteer process. He stepped forward without hesitation. The room fell silent. Someone scoffed. "Is this a joke?" The head of cardiology frowned. "This surgery is too important to risk any complications." He understood what they meant. They didn't trust him. So, instead of letting volunteers decide, the board made it a vote. The doctors voted on who they believed should be in the OR. When the results came in, there was a tie. 3 cardiologists, all receiving the same number of votes. The board met again. The medical director made the final decision. Whoever stepped into that operating room would be fully responsible for any complications. 2 of the cardiologists stepped back. They weren't willing to risk their reputations. That left only him. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. He was afraid of failing. But he remembered his father in that ambulance, remembered how helpless he had felt as his dad slipped away. He had become a doctor for this very reason. So he accepted. 2 days before the surgery, his friend found him sitting in an empty lecture hall, flipping through medical textbooks he already knew by heart. "You ready for this?" his friend asked. He nodded. His friend sat beside him. "Do you want to practice?" He hesitated. He had practiced thousands of times. He knew the procedure better than anyone. But his friend understood what he wasn't saying. They stayed in the hospital until midnight, rehearsing every possible complication that could arise. His hands still trembled at times, but he had learned to work through it. "You've got this," his friend said before they parted ways. He wasn't sure if he believed it. The night before the surgery, he visited the vice president's hospital room. The man was asleep, connected to monitors, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He stood at the doorway, staring. And then, he remembered his father, lying lifeless on the ambulance stretcher, his mother's cries filling the air. For the first time in years, he felt something sharp and raw claw at his chest. He turned away and left the room, his vision blurry. And just like that night in medical school, he found a quiet place and cried. But this time, it wasn't just grief, it was anger. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of every loss, every patient he had watched slip away, every moment he had been told he wasn't good enough. Tomorrow, he wouldn't let it happen again. The day of the surgery, the operating room was silent except for the steady beeping of machines. The team gathered in the VVIP surgical suite, reviewing the final steps. Outside, the hospital's senior staff and officials watched through a live CCTV feed. The stakes had never been higher. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. This was his moment. But then, as he made the first incision, his hand started shaking. His hands trembled. The scalpel in his grip felt heavier than ever. The room was silent except for the steady beep of the monitors. He could feel the weight of every gaze, his colleagues, the senior doctors watching from the observation room, the hospital board, and the countless people outside this building waiting for news. And for the first time in a long time, he doubted himself. What if he failed? What if he let another patient die, just like his father? His breath hitched. His heart pounded in his chest. He could hear whispers. He's freezing. Why did they even let him in there? Then the lead surgeon's firm voice broke through the noise. Step back, his hands clenched at his sides. He had no choice. He stepped back, his chest tightening as the other cardiologist took over. His mind screamed at him, but his body refused to move. The surgery continued. For the next hour, he watched, his own failure suffocating him. His hands were still trembling. He was proving everyone right. Then, the moment that changed everything happened. The vice president's heart began to bleed uncontrollably. The other surgeon's hands moved quickly, trying to stop it. But something was wrong. He saw it immediately. The other surgeon had clamped the wrong artery. The bleeding wasn't stopping. It was getting worse. The lead surgeon's voice was sharp. We're losing him. Get it under control. The tension in the room turned suffocating. Panic was setting in. This was it. This was the moment. For a second, he heard his father's voice in his head. You're special, son. Don't ever let them tell you otherwise. His hands were still shaking, but he didn't care anymore. He stepped forward. His voice was clear. Move. The other surgeon hesitated. The lead surgeon's eyes locked onto him. There was no time for arguments. Let him do it. The scalpel was back in his hands. His breath steadied, his mind focused. And for the first time, his shaking hands didn't matter. He worked quickly, precisely. He knew this heart. He knew every vessel, every connection. He had studied this moment 1,000 times. He clamped the right artery. The bleeding slowed. Seconds felt like hours. And then, the vice president's heart stabilized. The room exhaled. He finished the final sutures. The surgery was over. He stepped back, staring at the man's chest as it rose and fell steadily. He had saved him. He had won. Days later, the hospital held an award ceremony. The vice president, still recovering, personally thanked him in front of the entire medical staff. His mother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. When he stepped up to give his speech, he looked out at the crowd. The people who had doubted him, the ones who had called him a crybaby, the doctors who had refused to trust him. He took a deep breath, and then, for the first time in his life, he spoke from his heart. I became a doctor because of my father, he said, his voice steady. He died in an ambulance, waiting for help that never came. That was the moment I decided I would never let someone die like that again. His throat tightened, but he didn't stop. I've been called many things. Weak, a failure, a crybaby, silence. No one dared to speak. But I saved a life, and I will save more. His eyes scanned the room. His mother was crying. His best friend was smiling proudly. And the doctors who once doubted him, they were silent. He looked down at the award in his hands. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was meant to be here, and he was. The autistic boy who once cried in the supply closet was now the best heart surgeon in the state.